The purpose of this webinar is to increase public awareness that there are people who are becoming sensitized to chemicals to which we're exposed every day. What you will learn today is that multiple chemical sensitivity, or MCS, is a real physical condition, and that people with MCS refer to themselves as canaries because they're warning us that pollution is contributing to all kinds of other diseases as well. And what I really want you to learn is how to spread the message of the canaries. I began my family practice in 1976, and my journey into environmental medicine started in 1981. At that time, I had a patient with many complaints for which I could find nothing wrong, and neither could any of the specialists that I had sent her to. One day, she went to a health practitioner who dramatically changed her diet, and she found that there were numerous foods that were provoking her complaints. And when she stuck to her diet, the symptoms were either remarkably reduced or even disappeared. After that, I began to see other people who complained of so-called food allergies. These weren't allergies, they weren't hives. It wasn't asthma that was being provoked, but these patients seemed to have various symptoms provoked by many different kinds of foods which they just didn't tolerate. And then I began to see people who seemed to react to everything. One of those peoples was a woman that I dubbed the cigar lady. One day, at an appointment, she complained to me that someone in my office was smoking a cigar and was making her sick. No one in my office smoked, but I went out to the waiting room to check. I even went out into the hallway and then into the offices on either side, but there was no one smoking a cigar. I wondered how I was going to approach her regarding this potential delusion or even a brain tumor, and in order to be sure I was right, that there was no one smoking a cigar, I went downstairs, and lo and behold, in the office underneath mine was a man smoking a cigar. What has been learned over the years is that there's a pattern to environmental illness. These patients have chronic complaints involving multiple systems, especially the brain. They have symptoms of unexplained fatigue, they have poor cognition, they're spacey, they have a hard time staying focused, they have difficulty finding words, sometimes in conversation. They have chronic pain. Sometimes it's local, such as recurrent headaches, and sometimes it's more widespread, such as in fibromyalgia. Their sleep is disturbed. Most commonly, they complain that their sleep just doesn't restore their energy. They have mood changes, such as anxiety and depression. They have gastrointestinal complaints and respiratory complaints commonly as well. These patients are also more likely to have irritable bowel syndrome, symptoms of gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation. They also get heartburn, and they have an irritable bladder. They urinate more often than they used to, and sometimes have to get up in the middle of the night. Migraine headaches are more common, as are allergies, asthma, and eczema, and they are frequently sensitive to things such as chemical odors, foods, weather changes, heat, cold, noise, bright lights, and stress. And most significant is that routine lab tests are usually normal. We make the diagnosis according to the details of the pattern. If the main complaint is fatigue, and it's exacerbated with minimal exertion with recovery time prolonged, often more than 24 hours, we diagnose them with chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis. If the main complaint is widespread pain, we call it fibromyalgia. If the symptoms are provoked only in certain buildings, we call that sick building syndrome. And if the patients have symptoms provoked by multiple chemical exposures, we call that multiple chemical sensitivity. These patients very often have more than one of these four conditions. How common are these conditions? Well, let's look at the statistics for various chronic conditions that we know well, such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's disease. Look at these numbers, which were obtained by the Canadian Community Health Survey in 2010. Now look at this. Chemical sensitivity, fibromyalgia, and chronic fatigue syndrome are pretty common. And what is even more common is to have more than one of these conditions. That's more common than cancer, more common than stroke or Alzheimer's disease. Let's look more closely at the canaries, the people with multiple chemical sensitivities. They get symptoms from exposures to certain chemicals. the condition is chronic. They react at levels that are tolerated by everybody else and which they used to tolerate as well. But the symptoms go away or at least improve when those incitants are removed. They also react to multiple chemicals that are structurally unrelated, and of course, symptoms involve multiple organs. People with chemical sensitivities react to many things that are common in the environment, especially fragrances. It's not just perfumes, soaps, and shampoos, but it's scented laundry products, air fresheners, fabric softeners. They react to paints and glues and things that are used for renovations, cleaning products, new carpets, other building materials, new furniture, pesticides, vehicle exhaust fumes, and the list goes on and on. What do we know about why people with multiple chemical sensitivity become so sensitive? One of the things we now know is that these people are more likely to have abnormal genes controlling detoxification. That is, the breakdown of chemicals inside cells. And if you don't detoxify very well, you are more likely to create some damage. And that cell damage can be measured. We call it oxidative stress. We also know that neurons, nerve cells, can become sensitized to chemicals. We have a natural system for detoxification inside every cell because every cell has chemical reactions in which byproducts are produced that need to be broken down and gotten rid of because they can cause damage and are toxic. We have to break them down. We have to detoxify them. We have to eliminate them from cells. We have to eliminate them from our body. So we have a detoxification system. It's what breaks down medications. It breaks down all kinds of foreign chemicals that enter our bodies, not just the natural products produced by cell metabolism. The cell gets rid of things by putting it into the bloodstream, and our livers and kidneys are the specialists to break down and get rid of things from our bodies altogether. The byproducts of these chemical reactions that are toxic are called oxidants. They're also known as free radicals. And when that system of detoxification is overburdened, and we have too many oxidants, it causes damage inside the cells. This is what we call oxidative stress. This is why we need antioxidants in our diet to help protect us from oxidants. I'm not really changing the subject here, but do you ever wonder why hot peppers burn? It's because they stimulate sensors in the nervous system, and they send a message of intense heat to the brain. You can eat a hot pepper that's actually from the fridge or even frozen, but it will still provoke a sensation of heat. And this is because there's an ingredient in peppers called capsaicin that produces a sensation of heat. It's used in pepper sprays. It's what we take when we go camping in the woods if we want to keep away bears. It's what the police use to quell student riots. We spray it in people's faces, and their eyes will burn, and their nose will burn, and if you inhale it, you'll cough. So doctors have developed something called the capsaicin inhalation challenge. We give measured amounts of capsaicin to inhale, and we can study the mechanism of cough. And we can use that test to determine whether various cough medications are actually effective. Capsaicin stimulates sensors in the bronchial tubes. It irritates them and makes us reflexively want to cough it out. These sensors are also sensitive to chemicals. And it's in red on this slide for a very good reason, because MCS patients are hypersensitive to the inhalation of capsaicin. When we challenge patients with MCS with capsaicin inhalation, they start coughing way before everybody else, because those sensors, which are sensitive to chemicals, are turned on. Another word is upregulated. The threshold to stimulate a response is reduced because they become sensitized. This has been demonstrated after double-blind challenges, which means not only do the patients not know whether they're inhaling capsaicin, but neither do the observers until we open up the envelopes afterwards to find out who's reacting and who's not. It's not just 1 or 2 studies, but 16 studies that have been published in 10 years showing that patients with MCS react very sensitively to capsaicin challenge, demonstrating the sensor's hypersensitivity. There are no negative studies using this technique. There are other studies of MCS as well. Functional brain scans. A brain scan is done by taking a picture, often using a dye that is absorbed by the brain, so that we can see it more clearly. A functional brain scan is a scan in which we ask the brain to perform some kind of activity, and because that part of the brain is more active, there's more blood going to that area, and it will absorb the dye in increased amounts and seem brighter in the scan. So when we perform functional brain scans challenging patients with MCS with chemical odors, they respond differently than normal people. When we do a brain scan at rest, we're not sure we see any difference. But when we do it after chemical challenge, the differences are much more clear. Patients with MCS process odors differently according to functional brain scans. They also have an abnormal hearing reflex. And we've also discovered something called the metabolome, which is a very complex measurement of thousands of chemicals. The data is collected using high technology, and we're able to demonstrate differences in the pattern of human metabolism in various chronic diseases, including MCS. The pattern is different. So let's review what we've learned about multiple chemical sensitivities. We know that people with MCS are more likely to be poor detoxifiers. We know that they're more likely to have oxidative stress because we're able to measure this in research labs. We know that oxidative stress can cause damage to sensors for chemicals in the nervous system. And we know, lo and behold, that patients with MCS have hypersensitive sensors for chemicals. We also know that their functional brain scans differ compared to other people. So why isn't multiple chemical sensitivity accepted as real? One reason is that it doesn't fit our understanding of toxicology. Why would people react to low doses that everybody else tolerates? They're not toxic. It's hard to prove when we expose patients to chemicals with odors. We have a hard time hiding the odor, etc. It's hard to prove chemical sensitivity with chemical challenges. Some people just don't believe that reacting to chemicals at low doses is even possible, and they therefore conclude that it's a psychiatric condition. We know that opinions that go back even to the 1990s about chemical sensitivity not being real continue to be cited in the medical literature, and there's a lack of education in medical schools. Doctors receive no training on the conditions of MCS, chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, and fibromyalgia. Some people just resist change. Now, we have a new paradigm for toxicology. It's not necessarily based on how high the dose is. Dr. Linda Birnbaum is the director of the U.S. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program in the United States, and she published the following statements. Exposures to thousands of environmental chemicals fall in the ranges of doses that are thought to be safe, but the increasing data suggests otherwise. There are low-dose effects from dozens of chemicals, including industrial chemicals, plastics, plasticizers, pesticides, preservatives, detergents, flame retardants, sunblock, and many others. Proving chemical sensitivities has been difficult. Trying to challenge patients in a scientific manner with chemical exposures and to be able to make observations has been very difficult. The studies done have been very controversial. One reason is that it is hard to mask a chemical odor. So some people have tried to use other chemicals, but patients with chemical sensitivities could easily react to both. They tried using a nose clip so that patients could not detect the odor even though they were inhaling the agent. Unfortunately, some of the chemically sensitive patients found that their eyes would burn with the exposures, and therefore those studies were not considered scientifically accurate. There were other problems with design. For example, if you do a chemical challenge in an environment that is not clean, or if the patients have already had chemical exposures from other sources on their way to the lab for testing, they were already unwell and could not determine whether they were reacting to real chemicals or a sham. So the consensus of opinion based on these chemical challenges is that there's no proof for the existence of MCS. When a review was actually published of all the chemical challenge studies, even though capsaicin challenge studies had been performed, they were not included in the review. This systematic review, seen in this paper, stated that there is no proof that chemical sensitivities exist. What's the evidence that MCS could be a psychiatric condition? Well, there's an increased association with anxiety and mood disorders. What this means is that if you have a history of anxiety or a history of depression, you're actually more likely to become chemically sensitive. However, you're also more likely to develop other chronic medical conditions. It doesn't mean that psychiatric illnesses are the cause. Certainly the symptoms of feeling moody, poor cognition, unexplained pain, unexplained fatigue, etc. are also symptoms of anxiety and depression, so there could be confusion. But when we look at psychiatric treatments for MCS, they don't work. There's a few single case studies published in the literature using some psychotherapy, perhaps trying a patient on an antidepressant medication. There have been a couple of cases reported showing success in the literature, but there's no randomized controlled trials. In other words, no trials of using these drugs to see if they work better than a placebo. Certainly no double-blind studies in which the patients are not sure whether they're getting a placebo or a real medication. There's no long-term follow-up on any of the cases that were reported in the literature to see if the success of the treatment was actually maintained. The last report in the literature was actually published 12 years ago. What about the patient experience? Well, according to large surveys, psychotherapy can help cope with the illness. This is a tough illness to have. You can't take public transportation. You have a hard time going to social events. You have a hard time sometimes going to work. And you have to face the stigma of people not believing you. So psychotherapy can help to cope. But if you use psychotherapy to treat MCS as a psychiatric condition, it doesn't help. And in fact, when the medications are tried, such as antidepressants, they're more likely to harm. They're more likely to cause symptoms than to help. With respect to the observed association of anxiety and mood disorders with chemical sensitivities, you need to know that there is an increase, as I've already stated. As I have also stated, there's an increased association of anxiety and mood disorders with many other chronic conditions, including neurological disorders such as epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, strokes, Parkinson's disease, cardiovascular disease like high blood pressure, respiratory diseases such as allergic rhinitis and asthma, gastrointestinal disorders such as ulcers and irritable bowel syndrome, and there are metabolic and autoimmune disorders like diabetes, thyroid disease, lupus, and arthritis, which also have an association with anxiety and mood disorders occurring previously. Association means these things are more likely to occur together, but does not mean cause. It just means it's a risk factor. If you have a history of anxiety and depression, you're more likely down the road to have poorer health biologically. If we look at opinions cited in the medical literature from official medical bodies, let's look at how outdated they are. The California Medical Association had a critical opinion in 1986, but by 1993 they reclassified it only as historical. The American College of Physicians had a negative position in 1989, and in 1996 they said they had no position. The American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, 1991, 1993, negative statement on MCS. The American Medical Association, a negative opinion, 1992. The World Health Organization, a negative opinion in 1996. The American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, negative opinions, 1999, and a previously adopted paper in 1986. The last official medical body with an opinion that was published was in 1999, 18 years ago. There is clearly a lack of education in medical schools. No one is being taught in undergraduate training about the three conditions, MCS plus fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, or in particular about the impact of the environment on health. Students do not even learn how to take an environmental exposure history, and there's no postgraduate training in any specialty about the environment. And this includes respirology and neurology, cardiology, etc. What's interesting is that we now have a third-year training program for family practice residents in environmental health. This program is sponsored by the Ministry of Health in the province of Ontario, and we've developed it in concert with the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto and the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, also at the University of Toronto. However, we do have some difficulties in attracting residents to take that third-year training. There is just no interest. Here's a picture taken from our booth when the family practice residents in second year were being offered third-year programs in various disciplines. None of them were interested in ours. Here's more evidence for the lack of medical education. We performed this survey of medical practitioners in Ontario community health centers, and these are the results. There is a significant discomfort with the ability to diagnose in 92.7% of the respondents of the survey. And those who were totally or somewhat comfortable with treatment for MCS totaled the grand amount of 7.3%. Doctors, nurse practitioners, etc. did not know how to diagnose MCS and are not comfortable treating it either. Vocal bias from laggards. The term laggards refers to the last group of people to try or adopt a new idea. They dislike change. They don't accept new things unless they're forced to. They're what we call traditionalists. They swear by the quotes tried and true. They're reluctant to change, especially if they've been loud and vocal, yet wrong. So there's this quote, "Between the health care we have and the care we could have lies not just a gap, but a chasm." Who said that? The Institute of Medicine of the United States. Here's another quote. "Disseminating innovation is a major challenge in healthcare, and that comes from the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's just a fact. The information that is in the medical literature is very slow to be disseminated and applied in the practice of medicine routinely." The innovation of new ideas is an explanation for how new thoughts spread throughout the population. This is a graph of a normal distribution of population. Most people belong to the yellow and the orange groups. They're the largest groups. The green represents the leaders of a new idea. The yellow is when the idea starts to emerge into the population, and by the time it hits the orange area of the population, it's become mainstream. Down at the far end on your left are the innovators, 2.5% of the population. The people who come up with ideas that no one else has even thought of. And then there's the early adopters, people who are quick to change and adopt new ideas. And then there's the early majority as things start to catch on. Mainstream happens when the late majority also catches on, and now this is the new normal. And down there at the far end on the right, 16% of the population are the laggards. They're slow and reluctant to change. People are more likely to change if they think that the change can help them. The more knowledge people have, the more likely they are to adopt a change, because it begins to make sense and they understand it better. However, innovation has to be compatible with what these people believe, what they feel, what their own experience has been, what they need. Otherwise, they're going to be reluctant to change. The early adopters obtain information from the innovators. They have to spread the message for change. They need to be seen. They need to be an example for change. That's how the change progresses through society. They must be heard. They need to explain to people why the change is necessary. It can't just be a letter to the editor because the next day it's just yesterday's news. You need to talk to people. You need to spread the message. It requires social interactions. You need to use social media to spread this message. We need to get the word out about chemical sensitivities. We need to get people to understand what this is about. The Danish Environmental Protection Agency stated that on the basis of epidemiological data, that is, the study of the patterns of illness, MCS is a reality. The U.S. Center for Disease Control has stated that fragrance is not appropriate for the professional work environment and that some of the products in fragrances might be detrimental to the health of workers with chemical sensitivities. That's key. They recognize the disorder and they stopped allowing fragrances in the workplace. Hospitals. It's difficult for patients with MCS to obtain medical care in a hospital when they're exposed to many chemical pollutants. So hospital guidelines for MCS have been developed. In Australia, and now in Ontario, in particular the Quinte Hospital in Belleville, they've recently initiated guidelines for MCS. Many hospitals in Ontario, in fact all the teaching hospitals associated with the University of Toronto, are now scent free. If you want to get the word out, you can quote the Canadian Medical Association Journal editorial in October 2015, because they pointed this out, that federal and provincial human rights acts require accommodation for employees in the workplace who are sensitive to scents, but not for patients in the hospitals or clinics. Clearly, that's wrong. They pointed out that there's a family of receptors that have been identified on sensory nerves. These are the capsaicin-sensitive receptors, which are also known in my world as transient receptor potential channels. The capsaicin-sensitive receptors have been identified to support that patients can become sensitive to chemical scents. They stated that hospital environments free from artificial scents should become a uniform policy, and that education and promotion programs should be part of the accreditation standards. In other words, you have to educate and promote scent-free policies and stick to them, enforce them, in order to maintain accreditation as a hospital. They also stated that until this happens, individual hospitals should already take the lead, especially in spaces where susceptible patients wait, the waiting rooms. Here's what else you can tell people. Canada has 3 provincially funded environmental health clinics in Nova Scotia, in British Columbia, and Ontario. MCS is recognized by the Canadian Human Rights Commission as a disability with the right to accommodation. In Quebec and Ontario, MCS is recognized by their human rights commissions. The one in Ontario is where I work. It's affiliated with the University of Toronto as a teaching hospital. So we get medical students coming through our clinic, we get residents coming through our clinic who are interested in environmental health. The Ministry of Health in 2013 funded a business case proposal for a Center of Excellence for Environmental Health, and the results of that proposal initiated the development of a task force for environmental health. That task force is also working with the Ontario Hospital Association and Enhanced Long-Term Care Renewal Strategy, which means that we're trying to create housing for the future homes of people with MCS when they become elderly. The Ministry of Health is funding that third-year family medicine residency training program that I told you about earlier. That program is at the Environmental Health Clinic, and we work together with the Dalla School of Public Health and the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto. If your family doctor doesn't know about chemical sensitivities, tell him or her that they can get professional development study hours accredited by the Canadian College of Family Physicians in 2 different workshops. One is called Common Chronic Illnesses in the Environment, and the other is called Chronic Pain, Fatigue, and Chemical Intolerance Linked to Environmental Exposures, Office Assessment and Management. These are 3-hour workshops. They can get study hours for maintaining their license, and they can learn something that can be very beneficial to many of their patients. Tell them about it. MCS patients refer to themselves as canaries. They're alluding to the canaries in the coal mine, the story of which is that before modern technology, when miners went into coal mines, they were at risk for explosions from methane or death due to accumulation of carbon monoxide. Canaries are more sensitive to these gases than humans, so the miners would bring a canary down into the mine with them, and if the canary stopped singing or fell off its perch or died, they knew that they had to get out of the mine before they too would be overcome by these gases or an explosion. MCS patients refer to themselves as canaries in the coal mine because the canaries are real. They are warning the rest of the population that chemical pollutants that they can sense and are reacting to at levels that we think we tolerate are not tolerated by the general public either. They just don't know about it. Those exposures are leading to increases in many chronic conditions: cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, immunological disease, diseases in children. We need to listen to the canaries. We need to get the word out. Recommend this webinar to everybody you know. Family, friends, colleagues, teachers, your doctors, politicians. Let everybody know that pollution is causing increases in disease. Forward this link to all your social media contacts. Get the word out. Thank you.